Oh, good evening. It's June 4th, 2026, and welcome to another one of our Branches on the Vine with the Bible Project. And tonight we're going to continue our exploration of the Ten Commandments, right? The Bible Project created this series as they've studied these instructions, rules, guidance, wisdom that God gave us through the commandments in the Torah, starting with the 10 words. This series will follow the Bible Project's work, but they'll be guiding us as we journey through this entire series. And remember, the videos we're going to discuss, they're only the tip of the iceberg. We're here to expand the conversation, to look under the water, to open up dialogue, to stretch our thinking, maybe even our beliefs. So let's continue the discussion on this sacred collection together, wandering with dusty feet, well, along the way. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you're not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook. At the Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And of course, before we jump in, quick reminder, if you find these discussions useful, please click subscribe. But if you think someone else might enjoy exploring the scriptures this way as well, right? That's when you hit the like button, because that really does help more people discover this series. Because along this road, we're going to ask lots of questions. Questions about the text, history, people, choices, patterns, meaning. And the answers? Well, we'll see where the path leads. So I've decided to try something different, maybe this way, to give you an expectation, right? So to hear the context of tonight's discussion, this one amongst ourselves, right, you're going to need to go to the Bible Project, go to their app or their website, and give this episode, Second Command, a listen, right? It's our launching point, but you get to go listen. Hope that helps. So last time we looked at the first commandment, right? No other gods. You shall have no other gods before me. And if you remember, we discussed the issue was not simply belief, right? That this God was the God. It was about allegiance. Allegiance to one God. Who gets your loyalty? Who sits on the throne of life? And tonight, we're going to engage with the second commandment. But at first glance, it almost seems repetitive, right? If you're not supposed to have other gods, why do you need another commandment about idols? Yeah, isn't that the same thing? But the Bible Project points out that these are 2 commandments that they are related, but they are no way identical. The first commandment asks who we worship, right? The second commandment asks maybe more how we understand, how we represent the God we worship. And I think that distinction, it's going to open up an entire world of discussion and wisdom for us to access, right? So let's walk about this for a while. Let's walk around. So the command appears in Exodus 20, right? So you shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything in heaven above, on earth beneath, or in the waters below. So truth be told, for many modern readers, this command might feel kind of distant, right? After all, most of us don't spend our weekends carving wooden statues. We don't typically bow down before golden calves, so it's easy to assume this commandment belongs to another culture in another time. But I'm more convinced that the deeper we look, I really do think the more relevant this becomes for us. But to understand the command, we do need to step back into that ancient world, to the cultures surrounding Israel, right? Idols are not merely decorations. They were considered physical representations, right, of these spiritual beings. This will begin to walk us down what might be an uncomfortable path, one that we often talk about here on the Dusty Feet, the auto response form of, but that's not me. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Fair? So a god was believed to somehow become present through that image, right? The idol became a meeting point between this human world and spiritual world. So people would carve them, people would buy them, people would carry them. They'd build temples around them. The idols gave people something visible to focus on, something tangible, something they could control. And there's that word, control, right? Maybe it's one of the keys to addressing this command, because idols, most often, right, they allowed people to believe they could manage the divine, right? If you performed the correct ritual, you offered the right sacrifices, maintained the image properly, perhaps that God would give you what you wanted, what your prayers were for. Good crops, healthy livestock, military victory, fertility, prosperity. That's a scarily uncomfortable theology that's still present today. And protection. So the relationship became transactional, right? You do that, I'll do this for you, and you can do this for me. I want us to listen carefully. The God of Israel refuses to participate in that kind of arrangement. Yahweh cannot be reduced to an object. He cannot be contained inside a statue. He cannot be manipulated through any kind of ritual. He cannot be controlled by human hands. So this is a radically different understanding of gods at that time. This God is different. But think about the irony here, right? The creator of the universe that made humanity, right? Then us as humanity, we start making gods, right? The created begins creating its creator. But the Bible, these scriptures, they consistently expose the absurdity in that reversal of roles. Yeah, the prophets, they especially love pointing this out, right? A man cuts down a tree. Half becomes firewood, the other half becomes a god. He cooks dinner with one portion. He worships another. I mean, the prophet Isaiah almost sounds sarcastic when he's describing this. Honestly, maybe he intends to, because that contradiction is obvious to him. How can something made by human hands become the source and purpose of human life? But before we laugh at these ancient people, perhaps we should pause, because modern people create idols too. We just simply use different materials. We use different names, right? The Bible Project makes an observation that deserves careful attention, because they say this: humans were never meant to make images of God because God had already made his image. Humanity itself, right? This takes us all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis 1, humanity is created in the image of God. So that means God's already established his authorized representatives. We're the images. People, right? Not statues, not carvings, not monuments, living human beings. What did they say? God is passionate about his creation. Think about how profound that is, right? Because ancient kings, they often placed images of themselves throughout their kingdoms, and even not so ancient ones, but image reminded everyone who ruled the land. In Genesis, God placed his image into creation. It's actually part of creation. So it's not as stone, it's not as wood. It is living people created in his image to reflect his character, to represent his rule. And perhaps that helps explain a bit of why God forbids idols, right? Because idols reverse the design. God made human beings in his image. But idolatry, it tries to remake God into our image of choice. And I think that's where the real danger is for us, right? Because once we create God in our image, right? Even a representative image, something changes. Because then we begin assigning him to our priorities, right? There's our preferences, our assumptions, our prejudices, our fears, our politics. Instead of being transformed by God, we begin transforming God into something it's more comfortable for us, something more manageable, something we then use. Because something that agrees with us. We even use phrases like in God's name. Yeah. And if we're honest, this temptation that we saw in the beginning, it's never disappeared. But for us, most people, we don't worship statues. We do worship a customized version of God, this version might never challenge them. It might never correct them. It might never disagree with them. Might never ask them to change. A God who conveniently shares all of our opinions. And I think that might be one of the most sophisticated forms of idolatry, because it's not rejecting God, it's redesigning him. But think about Israel's golden calf, right? This story appears only weeks after Sinai. Yeah, the people become impatient. Moses is gone. The future feels uncertain again. So they ask Aaron, make us a god. Aaron forms a golden calf. But the shock here is they are not necessarily claiming that they've abandoned Yahweh. That's not it, right? Instead, they attempt to represent Yahweh through the calf. They're creating an image of God. That's exactly what that second commandment is purposed against. Because the problem wasn't merely worshiping another deity. The problem was reducing the living God to a manageable symbol, right? A visible object, something they could see, touch, control. And isn't uncertainty what often drives maybe idolatry, right? When life becomes difficult, when answers seem delayed, when God feels distant. I think the temptation is to grab a hold of something visible, something immediate, something tangible, something that feels maybe safer than trust. I think the challenge of biblical faith, it's always been trust. We saw this in the story of Abraham, even back then, trusting the God we cannot see. Trust the God we cannot control. Trust the God whose timing differs from ours. Trusting the God whose wisdom over all time has exceeded ours. But I think that's why idols today are so attractive, because they remove mystery. They eliminate perceived dependence. They create the illusion of certainty. But when we have those idols, or when we form God into our version, right? We shrink God. Bible Project mentions they shrink God. Whenever we shrink God, though, I think we also shrink ourselves. And another thought. Remember, we become like what we worship. We've heard this phrase, right? The Psalms repeatedly suggest this idea that People worship idols that they cannot see, they cannot hear, speak, understand. And then eventually hear terms when they become spiritually blind themselves, spiritually deaf, spiritually numb, more like the objects that they do worship. But the reverse, I sincerely and truly believe, is also true. I think this is it. If we worship the living God, we gradually become more alive. We become more compassionate. We become more loving. We become more patient, more just, more merciful. The object of our worship shapes the persons that we become. So maybe that's one of the deepest warnings inside of this commandment, right? Because idolatry is not merely about offending God, it's about deforming humanity. It damages the image bearers that God created us to be. And now our lives, we are wrapped around the consequences of all these choices we've seen in the past. And God is, well, He's letting us live our choices. So as my dad says, bring this into everyday life. How does this fit today, right? So what are some of the idols maybe of our age, right? These are easy. Technology, success, politics, money, entertainment, comfort, security? Perhaps those. But remember, an idol is not necessarily something inherently evil, right? It often begins as something good. I mean, something useful, something beneficial. But the danger occurs when good thing becomes an ultimate thing. Work. Oh, it's good. But work, yeah, it can become worship. Family. Family, very good. But family can become worship. Patriotism, it can be good. But patriotism can become worship, and even ministry can be good. But ministry can become worship also. Anything that can become an idol if it replaces a relationship with God Himself, right? And an idol is anything we depend upon more than God, anything we trust more than God, anything we fear losing more than God. Anything that becomes the center around which everything else evolves. So maybe this is a useful question. If this, fill in the blank, disappeared tomorrow, would my identity collapse? Would my purpose disappear? Would my sense of worth vanish? Because perhaps if the answer is yes, we may have discovered something dangerously close to an idol. I like when we notice we really can read this, that God does not give this command because He's insecure. I do like the direction we've gone with this, that the command is protective, right? The same God who delivered Israel from Egypt, He understands that human tendency towards slavery, right? God was the one of rescue. I will be your God, you will be my people. But we often escape one master only to serve another. We abandon Pharaoh, and then we build golden calves. God knows that idols always overpromise. They promise peace. They create anxiety. They promise security, right? But they create fear. They promise freedom. They create dependency, and they promise fulfillment. They just leave us wanting more. But I think that's because idols were never designed, right, to carry the weight of ultimate meaning, right? Only God can do that. Only the Creator can bear the expectations that we often expect or put on these other gods. everything else eventually breaks beneath that pressure. Let's wrap this up. I want to leave us with a few questions, not questions for quick answers, just questions for us to reflect, to talk amongst yourselves about. Like, where am I tempted to reduce God into something manageable, right? Where I get a quid pro quo for him. I do this for you. I pray to you. You do this in return. Where have I made God look more like me instead of allowing myself to look more like him? Maybe to reflect the life of the example of his son, our Messiah. Yeah? What do I trust when life feels uncertain? What do I run to first when fear arrives, right? What shapes my identity most deeply? And what would be the hardest for me to surrender? Even the Messiah asked this question through parables, through stories, to his people. The second commandment is not simply about statues. It's about trust. It's about representation. Yeah, it's about identity. And again, in that, I think ultimately transformation. I think because the God of Scripture refuses to be reduced to an object. He refuses to fit into a box. He refuses to become a tool for our agendas. And I think instead he invites us into something much larger, to become his image in the world. Remember, that's our purpose all along from the garden, to reflect his character, to embody his wisdom, to represent his kingdom. And his son reminded us of that. So I like where Tim and John, they talk about from the very beginning of this discussion, right? To be a holy nation. That would be set apart for a purpose, a priestly kingdom. That would be set apart to serve. Got to serve somebody. And the representatives of him to the nations, right? To the rest of this world. But that would be through his image and not ours, or ones that we've contrived. Because God says, he says, I am yours. You are mine. I think that ancient question still remains. Will we create or even reduce God to our image? Or will we allow God to remake us in his? That question, I think it may be just as important as it was in the garden or Mount Sinai. I think as it is for us as we live our lives today. So thank you for joining me on this episode of the Dusty Feet, right? So next time, we're going to explore the third commandment and discover that taking God's name in vain, it's a little bit more profound than simply avoiding certain words in our vocabulary. Yeah, so until then, keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep walking the dusty roads of Scripture. And as always, shalom, shalom with dusty feet along the way.